Welcome, universe, to the Vice Report radio show, the English-speaking world's leading news site regarding sex and porn addiction, the impact on children, family, spirit, work, and the law. And I am your host, Craig, founder of thevicereport.com, attorney, advocate, coach, father, husband, and warrior poet. Today we are talking about sex addiction. Fact or fiction? Who suffers most, the spouse or the one with the affliction? Is it real? Is it fake? Real science or a big mistake? Slam on the brakes, young guys can't get it up for goodness sake. And what's going to happen to all those wedding cakes? Check it out.
And I have a very, very exciting show today. With me I have Dr. Davidley, clinical psychologist in practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And doctor, just real quick, because I know you've taken a lot of flack for your book and for your position, just we'll set the record straight. You do not have horns. There is no tail. And you've dedicated your life to helping people, haven't you?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I've spent the past 15 years in practice working in many parts with individuals with sexual problems, with relationship problems. I've worked with domestic violence. I've worked with adolescents and adults across a number of different states.
George, you've done the same thing, dedicated your life to helping other people around treating their sex addiction. And George Collins wrote the book, Breaking the Cycle, Free Yourself from Sex Addiction, Porn, Obsession, and Shame. So good morning, George.
Good morning. Good to be here.
So one of the things that I just wanted to put out there for us to talk about today is that sex addiction, it's so polarizing. People on both sides of yes, it's real, no, it's not. So what I wanted to do today is the Vice Report, me, likes to walk the middle way. The more I learn, the older I get. When I hear someone say an absolute, then I kind of look the other way and just to see what's there on the other side of that absolute, because that's when I learn. And so I'm hoping today that we can do that with you, David, and you, George. So, David, tell me, why did you write this book?
Well, you know, my first book was about female sexuality, and one of the characters I encountered in writing that book was a gentleman that, in the book, I said he could very easily have been diagnosed as a sex addict, but I don't believe in sex addiction. And you have to understand that I'm a formally trained psychologist. You know, I've PhD from an accredited university. I did dissertation. I've worked as a licensed psychologist in the field for a dozen years. And I made that statement because in psychology and in science, in research, sex addiction is just not an accepted diagnosis, and frankly, it's regarded with tremendous skepticism. But as I was out there publicizing my first book, in the popular media, sex addiction is regarded as real, and people believe that this really is something that's out there that doctors should be diagnosing. And there was.
You make an excellent point. They have, when you read the articles, and as the founder of the Vice Report, the curator of someone who's been reading hundreds of news articles on a fascinating subject, that conclude that opposing viewpoint isn't really there publicly, is it?
Right, exactly. I mean, there have been a number of very significant articles published that challenge the concept of sex addiction in the scientific field, but they've never made their way into the popular media. And so as I was out there talking about my first book, that was one of the things that I kept hearing was, wow, in the popular media, people just don't even understand that there is a debate. Regardless of whether my view is right or wrong, they don't even recognize that there is a discussion to be had here. And I thought it was interesting.
No, David, I agree. I agree. Let me just stop you there, because one of the reasons that, to me, that I've noticed why, at least in the public media, they may not be having that debate is because there's a problem. It's so prolific. It's impacting so many different lives. I'm a lawyer. I'm seeing the impact on corporations with pornography and sexual harassment verdicts, all sorts of crazy things. And, George, that's the exact reason, or one of the reasons you wrote your book, Breaking the Cycle. So tell me a little bit about that, and how do you react when you hear Dr. Lay saying the myth of sex addiction, and just real quick to be mindful of the name of your company is Compulsion Solutions, or your treatment center for folks like this. So can you elaborate on that, George?
Well, the truth is I named it Compulsion Solutions, not Addiction Solutions, because I don't like the moniker either. It's just that it's stuck. It's what people talk about. I think that there's stigma attached to the word addiction, and I don't even want my guys to be stigmatized. Our job when someone comes to me is to look at their behavior very, very, very soundly, and get over their problem. What I think the problem that Dr. Lay and I have is that this notion of not being able to control behavior and why. I get a sense that Dr. Lay believes that people should just get it right and get over themselves.
Well, Dr. Lay, you've treated folks with drugs. You've treated folks who would present the symptoms of sexual addiction. Respond to that.
I think that this is a big and a complicated issue. George and I are in agreement that the word, it is, and there are so many big issues that my book is not a small book. I've got a
footnoted and everything. Dr. Lay footnoted. Sorry to interrupt, but that's impressive these days. So it was nice to actually go to the source.
Well, because it's so controversial, I had to extensively research this and be prepared to defend every one of my opinions, and I think I did. George and I agree that the word addiction has tremendous baggage. The word addiction has so much social kind of embedded language and meaning that it is complicated in and of itself. George has a point with regards to my view, and that is in many cases, folks who are presenting as sex addicts are folks who have not exerted control over their sexual behaviors, control that I believe that they have, and that it has not been demonstrated that they do not have. But I think that sex addiction is a huge concept that involves lots of other things. And one of the big problems is that, and George uses the word compulsion, but diagnostically, a compulsion is not diagnosable for a behavior that is innately reinforcing or rewarding. So people cannot be...
I want to stop you there because that's an interesting point. And George, tell me why does that matter? And that's what I'm trying to get my arms around. Why is the label important? We see the problem, we recognize the problem. I'm confident we're going to talk to David about this, Dr. Lay, that he has treated folks who present with these kinds of compulsions. George, why does it matter? Why is this label even important?
The problem I have with this is that men come to me, their wives call and say, this guy's out of control, he's having sex with women all week long, and then comes home and he wants sex from me. And I have to say to the guy, you need to stop your behavior. And he says, well, all guys do it. All guys look at Playboy. All guys mess around. I just have a high sex drive. And I talked to him about intimacy, into me you see, and I talked to him about really, really showing up for an intimate relationship, and that in my book and in my life, because of my background, I had no role models for intimacy. I had no one to show me that intimacy was better than just having sex, and so I chose sex, and it was out of control. I had to masturbate 3 or 4 times a day. I'm a sex addict in recovery, and I call it being a sex addict. It doesn't matter to me. It's not stigmatizing to me. What it is something I don't want to be. And if the moniker suits you, wear it. If it doesn't suit you, use another moniker. But when people are out of control and can't help themselves and lose their jobs and lose their visitation rights to their children, I don't care what we call it, Dave. What I want to call it is let's get over it. Let's get over it together.
Well, George, I think it is very important what we call it when we are dealing with medicine and when we're dealing with science. And I have to be clear, that I, as a professional, do not have a problem with 12-step groups. I run a very large treatment program that has a huge substance abuse treatment program, and we send people to 12-step recovery programs all the time, and I think they are an important part of people's recovery.
Now, David, for sex addiction too? For sex addiction too?
No, I don't, and I'm not really going to go into that. But what I will
save that for Tom Brokaw.
Well, what I will, just because it's complicated.
It's complicated, it's controversial, and we've only got an hour.
Yeah. What I will say is that, that kind of support is valuable. And, there is a 12-step group for messyholics, people who are addicted to messiness. Well, are we going to call being messy a medical illness? No. But with sex addiction, there is this idea that because there are people out there who believe that they are addicted to sex or believe that they have a problem with controlling their sexual behaviors, and there are enough of them that all of a sudden that tide should force medicine into declaring it a disorder. That's not right, and that's not the way medicine works, and it's not the way science works. The other problem is that, George, it is important what we call it when we are using medical language because we have to be precise. And if I go to my doctor and I actually have a virus, but he treats me for a bacterial infection because the symptoms may look the same, the treatment is not going to work. It might make things worse, and in fact, it might make that virus more antibiotic resistant and lead to greater problems. So using the word compulsion when it's not in fact a compulsion, and when there is medical definition of what a compulsion is, using that word inappropriately causes problems. Secondly, there are so many definitions for sex addiction, and that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. Actually, the first chapter is dedicated to this because there are dozens of definitions, and every therapist and every writer, and yourself included, George, have a pet kind of definition, a pet approach. A lot of folks use Carnes' approach, but then they bring in other kinds of things into it. They call it a sexual compulsion, an impulsive-compulsive disorder, hypersexuality, sex addiction, erotomania.
You got about 20 on the page, David. There's about 20 on the page with the different terms. Now, George,
it goes on and on and on.
I want to hear from you because there is certainly in the scientific community there's a hypothesis and there's a test for that hypothesis, and there's money in terms of do insurance companies pay for this? As the Vice reporter and as a lawyer and as someone who's had some success in business, you always follow the money. And there's a lot of money in pro-sex, and then when pro-sex community evolves into or moves towards the adult entertainment industry, and there's a whole bunch of issues around that. So you, George, you're kind of, you strike me like this guy from New Jersey, no nonsense, no bullshit. I'm a sex addict. And by the way, I want to say to both of you, man, George, to come out and talk about your story the way you have, and David, for you to challenge this issue and write a book, really telling, delivering a tough message. I just want to say that I think both of you are very brave, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
So, George, I want you to respond to what Dr. Lay talked about was around compulsion and the need for medical precision. And how does that really relate in your day-to-day?
Well, I'm in the trenches. I'm not worried about medicine. I'm not worried about insurance. I don't bother with insurance here. We'll write for insurance, but and sometimes people get paid. I'm not worried about it. What I'm worried about is someone whose children are suffering, who's losing his job, and who's a total disaster, like I was. I lost 2 wives over this problem. I lost them because I was out of control. I had a substance, and that was Penthouse or Playboy magazines, that if I didn't have it, one day I looked down at my hand when I didn't think I could, when I tried not to have it, and I had the DTs. I had my hand.
You had physical symptoms.
Yeah, I have plenty of clients that have physical symptoms. There was an interruption to our call just a minute ago from a young man who's calling me 3 times a day, checking in, bookending his days because he has physical symptoms by not being with prostitutes. And I don't coddle anybody. I'm not interested in babysitting somebody, but I certainly will I certainly have experienced these things, and to me, that suits the word compulsion.
There's biology, there's evolution, the evolutionary component of or benefits and cons of monogamy, of the polymorphous lifestyle that I've learned a lot about, David, since listening to your interview with Cunning Minx and reading your book. And so, but that chemistry part, David, I know the American Society for Addictive Medicine said, yes, it's an addiction. They've included a number of other behavioral addictions. There is science that I've read out there that noticed the dopamine, the oxytocin, all sorts of things that you folks know better than I do. But what about that physiological reaction? Why can't it be an addiction?
Well, I'd like to respond to that. I want to cover just one thing though, and that is that George, there are people out there that are creating problems in their lives with their sexual behaviors and with many other behaviors. And there are people who come to my office who you might call a sex addict, and I'm going to say, no, they don't have an addiction. But I agree, they are coming to me and they need help. And they come to me and they say, I want your help. Now, I argue that it is a very different thing to come in and say, I'm a sex addict, I can't control my sexual behaviors, versus coming in and saying, Dr. Lay, I need help making better decisions about my sex life. I think
we're doing the same thing. We're really doing the same thing.
Exactly. Now, maybe something we'll talk about is I think all of the problems in the message that we are putting out to people when we talk about an addiction, when we're telling people that things are out of their control, because I think that creates more problems than it is worth. I think that engenders feelings of powerlessness in people about their own behaviors and behaviors of others. But
David,
one of the things
quick, there is a strong component about that powerlessness in the 12-step and the notion of an addiction. So I just wanted to recognize that and just continue, because I want to hear about the biology and the science and all the things going on in the brain.
I don't have any interest in people, in coddling people. The day somebody comes in and says, I guess I'm a sex addict, I say, yeah, you're a sex addict right now, and as of right now, you're working against that. You're working to stop that business and don't even drop the label. So.
And that was one of the things I appreciated about your book, George, was that you did have that last chapter in there where you did talk about people's level of choice and control over their behaviors.
Have a choice.
And I appreciate that. I admire that.
David, I was thinking of you in chapter 10 when he says you always have a choice.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what I thought was interesting about you too. But I'm going to stop talking.
But I think
Your turn, David.
Before I get to the biology, it is important that we use the medical precision in our treatment because, George, if you want to be out there and if other folks want to be out there and they want to do, coaching, they want to help other people try and make changes in their lives from their own experience, that's fine. If they want to mentor, if they want to, be like sponsors like in the AA model, that's cool. But we don't call that medical treatment, and we don't call it treatment for a medical disorder. And it is important that we use the research and the background and the basis of medicine and science so that we provide the best treatment that is possible, and so we provide treatment to the right thing. Number one, there is no peer-reviewed scientific public research that shows that sex addiction has a positive effect. Now, therapists like you will say it does based on your experience, and God bless you, and I'm glad you're out there helping these people.
And you're talking about the label. The label has so there's no study, right? And these are those big
yes,
things.
Sex addiction treatment specific, whether you're going through the Carnes CSAT certification or anybody else out there that is saying, I'm providing sex addiction treatment, there's no research that shows that is scientifically effective. Now, I think that's significant. I think it's important. One of the things that I point to is just a few years ago, there was a decade-long scandal around recovered memory syndrome. And these were therapists who believed out of the goodness of their hearts that their patients had been sexually abused, even though the patients didn't remember it. And the therapist did lots of work uncovering those memories of abuse in their patients. And lives were destroyed. Families were blown up. People went to jail over these recovered memories that it turned out were false. Therapists were sued. Every therapist that has been sued over recovered memory syndrome has lost in court because they were wrong. They thought they were doing good, and in fact they were doing damage. They believed, without the basis of science and without the basis of evidence, that they were right and everybody else was wrong, and it turned out they were wrong. I'm concerned that the same thing is happening here with sex addiction. Just because sex addiction therapists and just because sex addicts believe so strongly that they have this addiction does not mean it's true. And there is danger in moving forward as though it's true when we don't have evidence for that.
My point is there's danger in you're telling people they're not a sex addict when they are, and this can create huge problems in families and with the client himself.
How does Dr. Lay's position and being in the public and being on TV and in the articles that sex addiction is a myth, what is the impact that
First of all, there's thousands of good, hardworking, dedicated people in the field. It's not just like recovered memory syndrome where there's 58 or 22 or 75 people doing this. This wasn't a big deal, as big a deal as sex addiction. Secondly, it's just really important for us to get that people are out of control. And out of control means compulsive. Out of control means there's a substance involved. The substance is sex. The substance is all forms of sex. And this is triggered by early childhood wounding, as in my case.
And what's the harm, George? I mean, that's what's the and one of the things that you guys I'd like you to do in a second is to kind of switch roles and hear the benefit from you, David, about why the label, how the label can benefit, and George, why it doesn't, because we've actually talked about that. But the impact on your patients, you mentioned that in your blog. I want to hear more about that. And then we're going to take a short break.
Yeah, people lose their jobs. People are relegated to supervised visits from. If this is coddled, and there is no such thing as sex addiction, I've heard of people who have gone out after they didn't want to listen to me and worked with somebody like Marty or somebody like that, somebody in that area, and they've gotten in terrible trouble. And lost their families, lost their jobs, and had big problems.
They didn't feel recognized. Well, good. That's David. You I know you've heard that, but I do want to spend some time on the biology. And if you need a few seconds to respond, but there's so much to cover, guys. And listen, we can do this again.
Sure.
I'm really excited about this. But let's go through what we need to go through. But I'll let you respond, David.
Let me go ahead and cover the biology because I can be scattered and there's so much to talk about.
We could go on for days.
Oh, absolutely. The challenge with the biology is that, and George, I mean this in no offensive way to you or to other folks who are talking about sex addiction, is that brain science is very complicated, and my research and experience notwithstanding, it is something that is beyond me. And there are gross generalizations and exaggerations made about brain science with regards to sex addiction that are not supported by the research. And the reality is that there is so much about the brain that we just don't understand. There is so much at an individual nature that we do not understand. There is not a single mental disorder, and that includes schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, two of the most researched disorders in the history of the world, with 100 years of research and understanding around these disorders. Neither one of those disorders and not a single mental disorder can be diagnosed based on brain findings, based on brain morphology, based on brain chemistry. And so for people to say that we can diagnose or that we can identify that sex addiction is coming out of a brain chemistry is an incredibly gross exaggeration. And that is the big challenge to the American Society of Addiction Medicine's statement around the neurochemistry is that
is there anything more chemical, David? I want to keep this a little high.
Ultimately, again,
like
even
that orgasm, that pow, that brain. Is there anything more real than that? That's the part that I'm not getting my arms around.
But that's the problem. We are a brain being. We live in our brains. Our brains are neurochemical. Even Sigmund Freud, 120 years ago, he believed that ultimately every disorder would end up being a brain disorder. He just didn't think we
What did he say about
the research?
David, what did he say about masturbation? What did Sigmund Freud in your book? You said, what did he say about masturbation?
Yeah, he viewed it as the ultimate addiction because because it was the natural thing that everybody wants to do. And he also viewed it as one of the sources for a drive, and for a drive to succeed, for a lack of satisfaction, that, you know, we are all pursuing satisfaction in our lives. But the brain chemistry is not successfully understood, or you know, there is one of the places where I will give you a little bit of a benefit of a doubt, okay, is that
that's what we need. That's what I want to see.
There is some research that shows that certain people with a certain genetic kind of indicator have a higher response to dopamine, okay, and that they seem to have a greater response to the reinforcing effects of dopamine than other people. And those people with that genetic cluster sometimes seem to end up more than we would expect, having problems with things like gambling, things like sex, things like drugs and alcohol is in that cluster, even things like just high adrenaline kinds of activities. But here's the problem. There are many people that have that genetic cluster that don't have those problems, and there are many people that don't have that genetic cluster that do have those problems. So we cannot simply say that these are brain issues and these are neurochemical issues. Number one, because we don't understand them well enough. Number two, because it is an individual variation, and people's brains and people's chemistry and people's genes interact with the environment. There's a tremendous amount of choice in there, just like diabetes. Diabetes is a physical health condition, and you can have one person whose diabetes is, I'll use your words, out of control, and you can have another person whose diabetes is not even an issue in their life because of the degree to which they self-manage. And those are the kinds of things that we have to take into consideration. Our brains are constantly changing, and one of the things that is said often is, well, cocaine or pornography and sex are 10 times more addictive than cocaine. That is an absolutely ludicrous, and that's an interesting statement, because crack cocaine and cocaine, there is no research that shows either one of them is more addictive than the other. That is a moral statement. It is a fear-based statement. Back in the 90s, during the crack cocaine epidemic, crack cocaine use was turned into a moral issue. But it was
a big mess. But let's get back to this, because we can spend an hour on that too.
But you know, sex is not an addictive thing. Sex is not a disease. You know, does pornography use affect your brain? Sure. So does riding a bicycle. Our brains are constantly changing, and anything that you do frequently is going to change your brain, and your brain is going to get better at doing that, because that is the way we are made. And if you stop doing that thing, your brain is going to change again. Our brains are constantly changing, and there is absolutely no way.
But if you stop riding a bicycle, I never went through withdrawal.
Okay, but and I think that's an important statement. Okay. There is anecdotal belief that people go through withdrawal from stopping using pornography or stopping sex, but there's no scientific evidence of it, and the withdrawal syndrome, the physical symptoms that you assert, have never been demonstrated scientifically. If they are there, they are nothing more than the physical symptoms of anxiety that any of us might experience if we don't get to do something we might want to do. That's not a disease, that's normal.
So, George, I want you to talk about those withdrawal symptoms, and that's something that I know someone who's experienced and who's used a variety of different drugs, and said sex and the porn are getting worse and worse and worse and harder and harder and harder, more frequent. That withdrawal was worse, and I understand where the science is, David, but practically, what are your patients presenting, George, and what was your experience?
Well, my own personal experience was that I would get edgy. You know, it's like with stop. David is right in certain ways, because you know, if you stop anything that's enjoyable, you're going to have feelings about that. And
it sucked for me when we left Disneyland. I was really upset. It sucked. I had a good time, and I was really bummed. Okay,
yeah. So, but with sex, there was a more, for me, and I can speak personally, there was a deviousness that came in. I had to have this substance. I had to have these magazines. I had to have these. I stopped 25 years ago, so thank God before the internet, or I still might be out there. But I had to stop, and I had to speak to someone who could actually talk to me about the pleasures of true intimacy and understanding intimacy and connected sex and connection, period. Because I had terrible role models for this, and it was useless to me. So
George,
I went through feelings. Like I said, I had the DTs. There were times when my stomach was upset. I get headaches.
George, I want you to hold that thought. When we come back, I want to talk about shame. And because that's both of you have spoken about that in your books, but from different perspectives. So let's take a short break. We'll be right back with George Collins and Dr. Lay. This is thevicereport.com. This is yours truly, Craig Pera. With me today is George Collins, author of the book, Breaking the Cycle, Free Yourself from Sex Addiction, Porn, Obsession, and Shame, and author, therapist, Dr. David Lay, who just wrote The Myth of Sex Addiction. Gentlemen, we are back, and when we left, I wanted to talk about shame and the role that plays, because what's fascinating to me, George, is the shame around addiction and the self-perpetuating behavior associated with that. And for you, David, the shame that this label has on others whose lifestyles may not be mainstream but happy within their respective boundaries in their world. So, George, let's start with you. Tell me how shame plays a role. It's on the cover of your book and the title. What does it mean to you and to your clients?
Well, shame is as they say, is the gift that keeps on giving. And so there's a cycle of shame. And Carnes talks about it early on. And, I was early on a student of Carnes and split off in different areas, bringing in spirituality to my work. But shame is the gift that does keep on giving. And so if you feel ashamed because of your behavior, it perpetuates. You're doing it again. There's a certain cycle that happens. And, I notice it with my clients. It's almost predictable. So what we try to do in treatment here is to interrupt that, to break into that cycle, and to have them, literally what I do is in my treatment modality is to have them actually speak to shame as if they were dialoguing, to rewrite the script of their life.
Talking to shame and literally having a discussion.
Literally talking to shame. People say, if I talk to myself, George, I'll go crazy. And I say, no, friend, if you talk to yourself, you'll go sane. So you sit down and you type out an email to me and you make this script. George, shame, are you there? And then put the word shame down and see what happens. You may sit there for 10 minutes, but after a while, something's going to talk. And
so, George,
there's no shame person inside you, but there is the subpersonality, the complex, that will talk.
Where does the shame come from, George? What is around our sexuality? David talks about it in some of the puritanical context around a behavior, belief, dream, fantasy that might be different than society's kind of monogamous. But what happens with our sexuality?
In more normal homes, in more, quote, normal homes, unquote, where there's this religious bias around sex, people say, don't talk about that. Parents say, don't talk about that when you're a little kid. When you're in the formative stages of learning, that's when you get your sexual education, whether you do or whether you don't. And one of the components of that is shame. And if you come from a shame-based home, whether it's religious or just your parents won't talk about it, I don't think I've ever had a person come into my office that's had what they call the talk, without there being the shame talk. There plenty of them have had the shame talk, which is, don't look at that, don't talk about that, don't look at me, don't do this, don't do that. And so shame builds itself up, and then I have another saying, you're only as sick as your secrets. So if you're secretly ashamed of sex, then you're really not going to be upfront and out there with it. And then there's the notion that, well, it's so wonderful and orgasms are so great and these pictures are so great and I can have sex with a prostitute and don't have to get involved. I didn't learn intimacy, so here I am, and the shame starts, and it cycles itself through, and you do it over and over again.
You know, George, it's fascinating because, I get where Craig is coming from, because in so many ways you and I agree, and I couldn't agree more with so many of the things you just said. You know, I deal with shame a lot with the patients that I work with, even though shame is a moral issue and shame is a social and a cultural issue. It's not a medical issue. It's not a psychological issue. There is no shame disorder diagnosis. But what shame is society and families as a part of society using shame to exert control over people's behavior. And one of the talks that I give often to patients is the distinction between guilt and shame. At a cultural level, you know, in Catholic guilt, if you do something wrong, you go into confession and you get rid of the guilt over that, and you do something to make it better, and you feel better. But in Asian
or you're burning for all eternity.
Yeah, well, but in Asian cultures, you know, if you feel shame, it is about who you are, not just what you did, but because what you did reflects who you are, and you can't change who you are. And sometimes the only way to make that shame go away on yourself and the family is through suicide, because shame is so intrinsic. But shame
That's why I don't have a lot of Asian clients.
Well, and there was something else you said, though, and I thought it was really, really fascinating because it gets to my point, and that is that you said you've never worked with anybody that has had basically a healthy talk around sex, that instead they have gotten this shame, this attempt to control their behaviors and their attitudes towards sex through fear and through shame. And I think that's significant, because what that means is, again, we're not dealing with a disorder here. We are dealing with people that are making bad decisions from a place of ignorance and from a place of lack of understanding of themselves and others. And what we are seeing, the reason, George, one of the big reasons why I disagree with the idea that there's an epidemic of sex addiction is because what has changed is not people's behavior but society. It is no longer acceptable in our society for a man to have multiple mistresses, even though 100 years ago it was. It is no longer acceptable for a man to blatantly kind of pursue sex with people other than his wife, or, you know, personally, and not engage with his wife, because society has changed. But people's behavior hasn't changed. And you know, when we make these assertions that, you know, there is this epidemic of out-of-control sexual behavior, I argue that there is no scientific evidence that anything is different except society. It is our expectations that have changed and our requirements. And how does society require those things? How does society enforce those things? Through shame. And the movie that just came out about sex addiction, what was it called? It was called Shame. That's a moral issue, not a medical issue. And what we are seeing is a conflict between people's behaviors, especially people's behaviors when they are coming from a lack of education, a lack of self-knowledge, and a lack of ability to make healthy choices, understanding who they are, where they are, what life they're in, and how these things all go together. But in other societies, in Middle Eastern societies, for instance, we're not diagnosing sex addiction, even though a man may be engaging in the same behaviors. And this is, you know, George, I agree with you. I have an intimate, wonderful, close relationship with my wife that is one of the great joys of my life. But
congratulations, David. That's a big deal these days in Georgia.
The value of intimacy is something that is not a universal. That is a cultural value in our society, and there are other cultures where relationships are not intimate.
I know.
And, you know, arranged marriages, for instance, you know, two people can get married who don't know each other. They're having sex. They don't know each other. They may become intimate after 5 or 10 or 15 years of marriage, but they don't start out that way. Is that unhealthy? No. That's a cultural value where we are saying that the best kind of relationship and the best kind of sex is sex and relationship that involves intimacy.
Now, David,
there is no evidence for that.
Yeah, no, but you talk about evolution. And so what's interesting to me is What about the evolutionary benefits of monogamy? So should a society, what I think of is Aleister Crowley, a quote that I remember someone in junior high telling me, "Do what thou shalt, and that shall be the whole loss." And so
yeah, he was a scary guy.
Scary guy, and for some reason,
narcissistic, egotistic, dangerous, selfish, yeah, all the bad things.
And but why that popped into my head, because if there weren't those societal constraints, some of them, to borrow a biblical reference, would we lead towards Sodom and Gomorrah? Because some folks believe that that's where we're headed now with the proliferation of pornography on the internet, sex ready to order in any major city, on any website or any telephone, back in the newspapers, back pages, whatever. It's there, and that's not a positive societal thing. So tell me why that maybe shame isn't a good thing.
I think evolution is a really important part of this argument, because I think it gives us some increased understanding of what we're dealing with. When I work with a client, for instance, when I work with a client who has been traumatized, who has been legitimately abused, and people who have experienced significant traumatic rape and everything else, what I work with them on is not how we can make that go away, because it's never going to go away, but how they can walk forward as a person that understands what role that plays in their life and how it's going to affect their decisions. I think self-knowledge is an incredibly powerful resource that we don't give people enough.
And George, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, go on. Finish evolution. George, you talk about that.
Evolution is a very powerful thing that we are not talking about. And, for instance, pornography, okay? Pornography, I think, shows some really remarkable things about male sexuality that we would not know otherwise, that show things about evolution, okay? Now, the overwhelming male sexual fantasy, the most universal common male sexual fantasy is to have a threesome with two women. So you would think, given that men are the ones that are accessing pornography on the internet more than anybody else, that the internet would be overwhelmed with threesomes with a man and two women, but it's not. And in fact, it's the reverse. There are the pornography on the internet is dominated, in fact, by images of a single woman with multiple men. Why? It's the complete opposite of what we would expect. What we have found is that there is a biological evolutionary reason for it. When a man watches pornography with a single woman and a single man, or when a man watches pornography with a single man and multiple women, versus watching pornography with a single woman and multiple men, when he watches,
I'm going to need a flow chart for that, David.
Yeah, exactly. When a man watches pornography with a single woman and multiple men, he ejaculates harder, and his ejaculate contains more sperm, and he gets an erection sooner, because his body is preparing to compete. From an evolutionary perspective, our bodies and the male sexuality was designed so that if there were other men there, the body responded to compete to try and conceive a child with that woman in competition with these other men and these other men's sperm. We would not know that without the role of pornography. Now, what that means, what I use that for, is to say to people, this is one of the reasons why you have such a strong reaction to pornography. This is what I say to men. This is something you need to understand about yourself. Yes, pornography is very stimulating and arousing, and this is one of the reasons why, because it is tapping into some biological, psychological things that we didn't even know were there. But
George,
that doesn't mean you can't control your behaviors.
Yeah. To sort of counter that, what I'd like to talk about is that at least once a week I get a call from a kid around 10 or 11 years old. And these kids, yesterday I got a call from a young kid who said, "Why is the man pee-peeing in the lady's face?" And I really like this stuff, and I can't stop, or I have to keep doing it. And this is the talk that he's getting. So that's the good that pornography is doing to the younger generation. The role modeling that we're getting doesn't have anything to do with intimacy. It has to do with, quote, pee-peeing in somebody's face. Now, at a 10-year-old level, Dave and I both know that this is a stage of sexual development that really has to go well for a child to turn out to be a well-adapted adult. Now, well-adapted meaning that he doesn't turn to sex as a coping strategy in his everyday life, and that he can actually function with, and maybe David would disagree with me, but personally, I'm a monogamous male, and David is too, and it would mess up his life.
Well, again,
how does a 10-year-old?
You wanted to talk about. Well, I can offer contrasting stories. So I had a young man come into my office, 19, 20-year-old college male who felt like his sexual behavior was out of control, and he was really desperate. He was worried he was a sex addict, and he was really having a lot of trauma, a lot of internal turmoil about it. And when we got into it, I found that the guy was masturbating once a week, but he had grown up in an incredibly religious, conservative household where masturbation of any sort was not acceptable. Is that an addiction? No. The problem there is an internal conflict between his sexual desires and the moral prohibitions that he was working with at an internal and an external level. That's not a disease. It is a conflict that needs to be worked out about making your own choices from a place of self-understanding and resolving these moral issues. I think those moral issues, absolutely, I agree with you, George. That's a fabulous case, and those are exactly the kinds of things that we need to work with. Again, and I think counselors like you are doing a great job to help them, but that's not a disease. That's not a medical issue.
What do we do about a 10-year-old kid that's forming his whole notion of sexuality on some man that's, quote, pee-peeing on a woman's face? I mean, he's forming his whole identity around his sexuality, and more and more kids are doing this. He wasn't 19
there
or
are
20.
millions, millions of people out there that have seen pornography and not experienced that kind of traumatic effect.
But David, here's where I really want to challenge you on, and I want your thoughts on this, because one of the things that shocked me as I started to do more and more research on this particular subject, and frankly, my own experience in doing research and talking to friends, that pornography has gotten more and more violent. It's in the history of mankind has never been more available. And you talked earlier about how the pornographers know, and in your book, it's going right to your brain. I mean, you can literally, the evolutionary biology is porn is allowing that to be studied in a way with the physiological reaction. It's getting worse and worse. I think you gentlemen are going to be in business for a very, very long time and have the long lines that you do because of the younger generation having this kind of exposure to this content. How does that play into your treatment, David? Certainly you have to, without judging, it's got to be a problem. How do you balance judging your sexual norms with the patients around? I don't even know what I'm asking. So you answer.
Well,
tell me where you're on that.
Let me talk about that a little bit. There are two examples that I include in my book that I think are wonderful examples of an unintentional argument that is made by the anti-pornography folks. And Sam Brownback was an American politician, and Marnia Robinson is a blogger. Both of them have taken on this kind of pornography as a demonic force kind of stance, and pornography as something that is negative and unhealthy for people. But Sam Brownback told a story about men that he knew that when they went to a hotel, they had to go to the hotel's office and have the hotel turn off the television in the room so that they wouldn't be tempted to use pornography. Marnia Robinson has lots of men write her that talk about how they've noticed that pornography is affecting their sexuality, their feelings of arousal, and their responsiveness in sex with their partners. And so they have had to limit their access to pornography to get back to a place of health. Now, both Marnia Robinson and Brownback put that forth as saying, look how dangerous and evil pornography is. I look at that and I say, wow, look how powerful these men are, that they are able to recognize that something they're doing, whether it is gambling, whether it is sex, or whether it is collecting model trains, is having an impact in their life that they're not happy with, and they have to exert control and plan control. They have to go down to the office and have that TV turned off. They have to exert control over that behavior to get back to a place of life that they want. That is the way we
addiction.
work.
But David, talk about pornography, David, because one of the things that I've learned so much.
Okay.
When you talk about pornography, well, hold on. Let me just finish because this is there's so many different kinds. Everything from Playboy to what is termed gangbangs, bukkake, violence against women. That's not even taking it out of the S&M type pornography. I'm talking about there seems to be a spectrum, David. And when we talk about pornography, some of it feels normal to me. And again, I try not to judge. I've got that visceral reaction side. Don't judge. And then some of it's like, oh my goodness, this is not good. This is really impacting children's sexuality.
Every legitimate research that has been done has shown that there is not more violent pornography today than there has been. Every research study that has looked at this has shown, in fact, that there is far less violent pornography than there is violence in the normal media. And I'll be absolutely honest.
You've got to show me the studies, David, because that's mind-blowing to me.
I have far more problems with things like torture porn that are these movies that are shown in normal theaters that anybody can access that show graphic violence and treat human life casually, that treat sadistic pain as something for entertainment.
What I don't understand is that years ago, I mean, not even very long ago, before the Internet, it was very hard to even get pornography.
You had to go to the bookstore, right? You had to drive down to the bookstore.
Yeah. Now, what has changed?
You had to be 18 or 21 to get in there.
Right. I agree with you. What has changed is access, and there is far more pornography and much easier access today than there has been. However, in the city of Pompeii, there's pornography all over the place, and that city was not destroyed by the volcano because of the pornography. All right.
But there wasn't
one of the things
video
that
graphic. David, it is different, right, than some writings on the wall than that video.
First I will make
they must have been very good drawings then.
First, I'll make an important distinction. What is pornography? Okay, we use that term very loosely, but Craig, you as an attorney would have a hard time going into court and getting a legal definition of pornography because it changes, because it is so broad. And here is a great example.
Well, just before you finish that, David, the Supreme Court, Justice Brandon says, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it.
Exactly, but that's not something that's not something I can use as a diagnosis, and B, that's not something that you can defend in court because it's subjective, and that's the issue. Okay,
well, they're hard cases to prove,
here.
But they are prosecuted. They do exist. That's hardcore. But anyway, I want to stay away from that. That's the law. I want to get back to what you're talking about.
There are people who are aroused by, at a fetishistic level, there are people who are aroused by watching somebody shiver, watching somebody who's cold as their body shakes. And pornography to these folks, and it's called shiver porn, is watching somebody who can even be fully clothed shiver. Now, I watch that. I see that. That's not pornography to me, but it's pornography to them. Now, how do we regulate that? Okay, so that's one issue, that we use this word pornography at this huge, broad level. And let's bring in the brain for a minute. So is pornography, does it include written pornography and things like written erotica? Because the brain is responding and processing those two stimuli, visual porn from videos versus literate porn, written words. The brain is processing those two things incredibly differently through incredibly different parts of the brain, incredibly different ways. Are they both addictive? Are they both porn? How do we tell? Okay, so that is a
tell
huge
by the result of the person that is experiencing it and how their family life is and their job and whether they're crying themselves to sleep at night.
Okay, and that's a behavioral issue. That's not a brain issue. And that's not a medical issue. Now, we can talk about people having behavior problems, and I am absolutely okay with that. But let's not call it a disease, and let's be careful about that. The other thing about the access to pornography is, as access to pornography has gone up, sexual crime has in fact gone down. Districts and regions and countries that have greater access to pornography have lower rates of sexual violence and lower rates of sexual abuse of children.
Now, listen, that's one of those tough statistics, and I'm not going to debate you on that because there's strong opinions on both sides, and I think both sides make very, very good points. But the access has been unprecedented. Children are reporting more and more for treatment. Certain sex acts are up among teenagers that I've read.
It is not going to go away. We are not going to proclaim pornography as addictive and dangerous and get rid of it. And the Supreme Court and First Amendment rights, it ain't going to go away. And where I agree with George and you and Craig is that this is out there, and it's something we need to deal with, and it's something we need to teach people how to deal with. We need to teach men, and we need to teach young men that this is out there. It is something they're going to experience, and we're not going to prevent that. We need to teach them and prepare them of how they can understand it, understand the impact that it can have on them and their lives and their sexuality. We need to help them make a conscious decision from a place of understanding, knowing that, okay, porn might be like junk food. Sometimes I like Twinkies, but if I eat Twinkies all the time, I'm going to get sick, I'm going to get bored.
And George, you
teach people to see it that way.
Yeah, George, you talk about that in your book, and tell me, how do you help let's get, you're in the trenches, right? Let's talk about that. How do you help your clients get their arms around this compulsion, addictive, bad habit around pornography, and what's your experience with it in your practice?
Well, my job is to help them observe their own mind, is to step out, because I'm in a more spiritual vein. I believe that everyone is their essential self, and that their mind is like a big computer that feels sitting on their shoulder blades, and it has been programmed a certain way. And so my job is to somehow help people to be able to observe themselves, and it's the same way that David talks about, is grow yourself a set, and it's the same thing. It's step out, watch what you're doing, be able to administer to yourself, and prove to me that you can do that.
And you've had a benefit. There's obviously a benefit. You've talked to me privately about the success that you're, really a revolutionary treatment for sex addiction, self-compulsion, bad behavior, whatever you want to call it. There's so much. We're here because that phrase is so charged. What are you telling these folks as they come in the door around this?
What am I telling them? I'm telling them to man up. I'm telling them, okay, like I said earlier, you called me about a sex addiction. Let's talk about what's really going on for you. We do the history the way normal counselors do history, and we understand if there was some sort of trauma that caused at an early age the thing that might have affected that kid that called me the other day. Who knows what trauma? Maybe I was some help to the kid by talking to him about what he saw. But, the babysitter that rubs her breasts on his face when he's 6 years old, or mommy stroking him, or taking way too much time washing his penis. All these things come out in the room, and once people understand their story, this is where David and I are on the exact same page. Once the story comes out, once they're clear what the story is, the, quote, addiction, unquote, dissipates.
Is there a benefit? I want to talk to you about the cons of the label, but first, the benefit. You've used the term, it's in your book. There seems to be a benefit to you or your patients or the treatment modality with the label sex addiction. How is that? How is the label?
It's better than saying I don't have a problem. That's all. That's all I say. I don't care about labels. The name of my business is Compulsion Solutions.
Now, David, what I like to talk both sides of the eye. As a lawyer, when I'm preparing for an argument or for a debate or for anything, I always want to understand the number one, number two, number three points that the other side is making. And I want to hear from you is what are the benefits? There's obviously a benefit. People are healing, but what are the benefits of the label sex addiction? What's the number one argument in favor of using the label sex addiction that you see?
If it if it creates a process by which people can look at something that they are doing that is self-destructive in their lives and creates a process by which they can start to exert some control over that, I will acknowledge that there is some value in there. I think that people do self-destructive things in their lives. I think that is a normal part of humanity. It is something that I like to help people with. And while it may not be an illness, it is certainly something that people struggle with, making self-destructive decisions. And I like to help people not make self-destructive decisions. And if identifying sexuality as a disease is something that lets them recognize that some of their sexual behaviors are self-destructive, okay, I'll play that game.
But get over it.
Well,
that's where we both do the same thing. Okay.
Yeah,
whatever you want to call it, friend. But now we do the work.
Yeah, exactly. Now we do the work. Now we start talking about willpower. Now, there's obviously, I come from a scientific base, and that's where, I try and bring science in, because I think what science does is science offers us the ability to be objective and not subjective. Kinsey said, "What is a nymphomaniac? It's anybody that's having more sex than a therapist." And the same problem is embedded in most sex addiction fields. Is that what is a sex addict? Somebody who is having sex that the therapist thinks is wrong, based on that therapist's lack of understanding, based only on that therapist's personal experience in their own lives and with their patients.
Well, that wouldn't be true for me. I would say anybody that's having sex that's unhealthy for them in their relationship or their relationship to work or their children or the person.
And again, I can agree a little bit, but what is, then we have to start talking about what is the definition of unhealthy. And we come back to right where we started, that there are so many dozens of different definitions, and there is such a lack of understanding about what is healthy and what is unhealthy. And because that healthiness is embedded in social values, I don't think we can agree there. But where I do think, George, you and I agree, is that issue of willpower. And there's some really interesting research by a social psychologist named Roy Baumeister, who has done fabulous research. He did some research recently on willpower, and he showed that willpower is a depletable resource. Willpower is a resource that people have inside, internally, that they can use up and exhaust and have to replenish. And he showed that a couple of important things relevant to this topic. He showed that if you tell somebody that they are not going to be able to exert control over themselves, or they are not going to be able to will themselves through a situation, then that depletes their ability to be willful and to make conscious decisions. But if you tell people that they are powerful, if you embed them with the ideas that they are powerful, that this might be challenging, but they can overcome it, people have more willpower. And he showed that you can have people in research studies exert will over decisions and make conscious decisions that they might not want to do, but that they do, that they force themselves to do, that can tire them. It literally can exhaust them, and that you can replenish that willpower by doing something, and this sounds silly, by doing something so minor as drinking a glass of orange juice, because guess what, and I'm going to sound like a hypocrite here, it affects the brain, because by giving them orange juice, it increases the glucose in their brain, it makes their brain work better, and the brain is where willpower comes from. And the more energy and the more resources somebody has to make good decisions, the better they are able to make good decisions. And so, George, you and I agree on this, because in your chapter on self-control, you talk about something that I talk about a lot, which is people should not make decisions when they are in a situation that they're going to make bad decisions. If they're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, people need to pay attention attention to the situation in which they are making decisions and prepare themselves to make good decisions. People need to know that for them to make good decisions, they have to be conscious, they have to turn off the autopilot, they have to wake up, they have to pay attention, they have to think about how I'm going to make good decisions and prepare themselves to do so. I think that applies to sex as well as everything else in our life. And we need to prepare people to make those good decisions.
Easy to say if you're not impacted. There were moments in my life where I was doing business. I was well thought of professionally. My marriage looked good on paper. And if I saw a woman bend over and expose her breasts, all of a sudden, because of the schemas, the hookups that I made, that I hate to say the word powerless, but at the time it seemed powerless. I went to the 12-step program because I didn't know any better. I didn't have any money for therapy, and I went through that period of time where I said to myself, I'm powerless over my addiction. And after a while, I said to myself, this isn't going to work for the rest of my life because I'm not going to go to these meetings six days a week. I've got to figure out a way to man up here and become empowered. And this is where I agree with David, where you empower yourself. But I couldn't for a long time. It was
David,
out of my
hold
control.
that thought. George, I hear you talking. Let's just take a short break. We'll be right back with Dr. David Ley and George Collins on thevicereport.com. Hey, this is Craig Perry of thevicereport.com. I'm here with Dr. David Ley, author of the book and therapist. The name of the book is The Myth of Sex Addiction, and George Collins on the other side of this debate. And actually what we're learning today, that there is some commonality, and when we find commonality, we can make progress, especially on an issue so controversial as sex addiction. The name of his book is Breaking the Cycle by George Collins, Free Yourself from Sex Addiction, Porn Obsession, and Shame. Gentlemen, we're started to move in towards this responsibility. And David, tell me why you can't have both. Why not have sex addiction and responsibility? You seem to talk about it being used as an excuse. Almost like in my head, I think of that scene, Namby, the namby-pambies who just can't get control of themselves and just can't stop. Why can't you have both?
Well, that is where I hold the field of sex addiction morally culpable and responsible for creating a social problem. For 30 years, the field of sex addiction has been told two things. It has been told, man up. It has been told, show us the research that proves what you're saying. And it has been told, find a consistent, clear definition that can be explained and defended. And instead, what I said earlier still holds. We have dozens of competing definitions. We have subjective approaches that cannot be applied scientifically. And so what has happened is that the concept of sex addiction has been co-opted. It has been taken over by the media, and now anytime somebody engages in behavior that is salacious and exciting and scary, the media says, oh, look, see, they're a sex addict. And that celebrity or politician goes to sex addiction treatment with the idea, oh, see, now it's all better. That problem is gone. And we are not holding those.
David, right? You mean you don't know? I mean, when you talk Tiger Woods, David Duchovny, you don't know their traumas. You don't know that it was a publicity stunt. I mean, to be fair,
no, I'm not suggesting it was a publicity stunt. I am suggesting that when we apply sex addiction as a label to these people's behaviors, we are not giving them the opportunity to be responsible for the choices they made. And here's a great example. Eliot Spitzer, former governor of New York, during the scandal over the prostitutes that he was involved with, his advisors approached him and said, Eliot, we think you should come out and say you're a sex addict and go to sex addiction treatment. That will make the scandal go away. Spitzer said no, because over my career, I have always demanded that people that work for me be responsible for their behaviors, and I am not willing to stand up and say I was not responsible, I was not accountable, I was not in control. I think while I might disagree with many things Spitzer did in his personal life, I think that's a powerful statement of personal responsibility and accountability that we are not demanding from people the way we should.
George, thank you, David. George, isn't it semantics, though? Because certainly I think a strong case can be made to use the Spitzer example that he, in fact, was out of control, although he's not going to come out and say he's out of control. He was acting in a way contrary to decades of very, very high moral service. I'm an East Coaster originally, now in California. He was revered as someone who prosecuted crimes, who helped women, yet at the end of the day was behind closed doors perpetuating this problem. George, tell me why. To me, does it feel like this? We're talking semantics, using this word, using that word.
I think it's great that Spitzer manned up, and I also would wonder if he doesn't look at his motives for just doing what he did, and my sense was, from what I read, and I don't have the hard copy here, was that my sense was, as a professional in this, that he was out of his own control. Now, whether he has maintained control, I mean, a lot of people can pretend to maintain control. People call that being a dry drunk. They can look like they're maintaining control, but they're not. I think it's wonderful that he said that he wants to hold himself to a high standard, but I would wonder under the surface whether he is in actual control or not.
So we talk biology. Thank you, George. We talk biology. We talk environment. Certainly to me, by the way, just back to Spitzer, it felt like he was out of control as a lawyer, someone whose career I admired, has held him in very, very high esteem, and to see that fall was really, really sad, and the impact on his family.
I think it's deceptively easy to look back, both personally and externally, to look back at somebody's bad decisions and assert that they or I was out of control. Because if you ask me during that time, many people will say, no, I'm in control.
Well, I can deal with that. I can deal with that if it happens once or maybe twice. But if you're doing it like Elliot was, daily, or you're going to huge pains to cover up his secrets, and I think he was flying to Washington or something like that, and it was just that's out of control.
And then instead of talking about control, let's talk about the issues of egotism, narcissism. Let's talk about the selfishness that is embedded in all those things. I think those things are far more important than saying whether somebody is in control or not, because they're in control because they are fulfilling those desires and those needs over others. If somebody gets married and says, I'm going to be monogamous, and then they go off and cheat, what are they doing? They're making decisions, and they're making decisions based on one value or one need over another, and they're not resolving those things.
I mean, the word decision, when I hear that, I wish I had that power years ago.
You talked about in your book. You talk about choice points. There are places where people make decisions
after treatment.
But there is that feeling
those choice points are there, and our job is to help people find them earlier.
I agree with you 100%.
And we can
probably great in the room.
And I think we should be teaching young men how to make those good decisions in advance,
David,
so that they don't get to these problems.
Yes.
Another sex educator, and I don't know her name, maybe one of you gentlemen do, recently suggested the same thing, and she was vilified. And what she suggested was we need to start teaching people about porn because it ain't going away and it's screwing up people's lives.
Yeah, that's very early age.
She was vilified.
I can imagine.
For that.
Yeah.
And I do agree with both.
That's because the shame-based puritanical things. The same people that are saying that will also either view porn or watch these commercials on TV with women with their breasts exposed, selling cheese and cars and every other kind of thing. So
sex in our culture is not going away. Exactly. It is an economic force that no matter how much, and that's I think the media issue. No matter how much we say, hey, this is an issue, this is a problem, we need to change this, it ain't going to happen. And we are told, we have a consumer-based culture, and we are told, consume, buy, and that message is out there in everything we see. Sex is no different. And so, the excessive consumption or pursuit of sex is something that our culture is telling us do. And I think, frankly, from a revolutionary kind of standpoint, I'm not saying I'm an Occupy, kind of guy, but I think what we do need to do is we need to be teaching people how to make decisions for themselves, regardless of what media and the society and government are telling them is the right thing for them. I think we need to teach people how to make healthy decisions for themselves.
And that's what you and I are doing. That's what you and I are doing in our small way, and with our books and with our talks. And I believe that the sex addiction people, this huge group of people that talk about sex addiction, is trying to do the same thing.
Sex addiction, sex in and of itself is just so complicated. It's certainly been complicated for me for reasons as this show progresses that I might be more willing to talk about. But to have Dr. David Ley here, author of The Myth of Sex Addiction, and George Collins, author of Breaking the Cycle, Free Yourself from Sex Addiction, Porn, Obsession, and Shame. Two books, important books on this issue. We're going to hopefully talk again real soon. I want these guys back. I'm very, very happy to have them. Dr. Ley, just final points in closing. What do you want to say to folks out there?
I really want them to engage in this debate. The intent of me writing this book was to say to people, hey, don't be sheep. Don't accept the idea that sex is a disease, that sex is an illness, without looking at what role sex plays in your life and how it is impacting it. I think that we need to have this debate so that people can stand around the water cooler and say, oh, yeah, he's a sex addict. No, he's not. I don't believe in it, and really engage in that discussion with themselves to identify what it means to think about sexual self-control. I think that debate is important. I think it's one that we're not having in our society, and I think that the response to my book is so powerful because this is a debate and a discussion that people have been wanting to have and been unable to engage in.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ley. I appreciate your time, your feedback, your commentary. This is fascinating. So, George, on that note, what do you want to say to folks out there?
I guess I have the jump on David as far as books go because Mike came out in October, and I want to just thank everyone that's possibly listening that has picked up the book and emailed me or called me. I appreciate the success. I appreciate the notion that those that have felt that they were sex addicted have gotten help. Those that have felt that they didn't want to admit to sex addiction have even read the book and left out the word addiction because I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. The moniker doesn't matter. What matters to me is that you get well. I also invite, as I always do on these interviews, anyone to call me. I'll give anybody 15 minutes or a half an hour to find out if you're sex addicted or if you're just stonewalling, whatever it is. We're here to help, and we give that. So sex addiction is what I do. I don't care about the moniker. What I'm interested in is that you get well. So compulsionsolutions.com is the name of the website. Go there for help or understanding, and give us a call. We'll help you.
Or if you're one of those people out there who has somebody in your life who's, engaging in unhealthy behaviors and is saying to you, it's not my fault, I'm a sex addict, then you can go out and buy my book so you have an argument to tell them, no, you're not, you're making bad choices.
And then buy George's book because, again, you can replace any name, any term that makes you most comfortable and heal from this pain.
David and I are actually on the same page. We're trying to help people. So.
Absolutely.
And that's what I'm trying to do. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Look forward to talking again.
Thank you.
FightSupport.com, signing out.